Welcome back. In this particular lecture, we're going to actually get started with the beginning of Christian historical theology. Now, some might say that the New Testament and the writings of the Apostle Paul, the Gospels, the writings of the Apostle John, etc., that's really the beginning of Christian historical theology. And in a sense, that's right. But most of the time, that's a separate discipline. That's New Testament studies, New Testament theology, and our concern is historical. And so we're going to be starting in this particular lecture with looking at the beginnings of what's called the post-apostolic period, or the period of the Apostolic Fathers. In this particular lecture, we're going to be looking at the dates of this particular era. We're going to be looking at the time frame that we're considering. We'll be considering some of the challenges that the church had to face in this particular era after the apostles. Then we'll be looking at who they were. We'll be kind of defining who the Apostolic Fathers were very briefly. And then we'll have a chance at the end of this particular lecture to consider the first of the Apostolic Fathers, Clement of Rome. And so let's go ahead and get right to that. The dates of the Apostolic Fathers. The post-apostolic era is often divided into two somewhat artificially determined periods. The immediate post-apostolic period is dated from the late 1st century into the early 2nd century, or depending upon which author you're looking at, from the 70s AD or 80s to about 135 AD. Now, those dates are, again, artificially chosen. Some would say that most of the apostles had passed off the scene by the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and that's true. But the Apostle John most likely was living, still ministering, and writing until the 90s AD. And so the era we're looking at here, this first part of the post-apostolic era, really overlaps with the apostles themselves. But the issue is really the passing of the apostles. And from about the time of after 80 AD, most of the apostles were gone. The second somewhat artificially determined part of this post-apostolic period is called the late apostolic period, from about 135 to 180 AD. So you're talking the central years of the 2nd century. This was the time in which the canon, or the New Testament, was being formed, or I would say probably better way to put it is recognized, because it was being formed as it was being written, as the inspired writings of Romans and the Gospels were being written and recognized by the church early on. This was the era in which challenges to that were answered, and other writings that some considered for inclusion in the New Testament were being looked into, and even some of the writings that we'll be looking at were considered, but were never considered a part of the actual canon. I know that in your reading, there's a chapter in Bruce Shelley's book. I've listed it for you there on the slide. And most of the time, the considerations of canonicity are dealt with when you're dealing with New Testament introduction and or bibliology, and so I'll leave that for them. The passing of the apostles was the key problem, or the key issue that this era had to face. And because they still had problems, the churches, as we're going to see, still had some issues that they needed to deal with. There were doctrinal challenges. There were ecclesiastical matters. That is, how are we going to do church? How are we going to answer some differences of opinion? These were things that had been delegated to the apostles. Think of Acts chapter 15. You've got a question about the content of the gospel or how it's being preached. Well, let's go to the apostles. We'll get them together. But after they passed from the scene, then those kind of questions had to be dealt with by others, and that's what this particular era is all about. So the first challenge for the early church in this era was simply to keep the faith. How do they take what they'd inherited, what they'd received from the apostles themselves, and pass that on? How to keep the faith. To do that, the church needed to follow through on the Great Commission, to preach the gospel. Matthew 28, 19, and 20. I'm sure you're familiar with that. The church needed to perpetuate the practices inherited from the apostles. They needed to do church. Acts 2:42 says that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the breaking of bread, that would be the ordinances, to prayer. Well, the church needed to keep doing those kinds of things. And with the apostles themselves not here, they needed encouragement in that way. And that's what some of the Apostolic Fathers did for them. This era, the church needed to maintain the doctrinal integrity of the church delivered to the apostles. They needed to hold fast. We already in the New Testament times, there were those. Jude talks about those who have crept in unawares. Paul talks about in Acts chapter 20 those who were wolves in sheep's clothing. There are people who are teaching error, even in the New Testament era. That became more of a problem in the post-apostolic era. And so in order to deal with the doctrinal challenges, and the most serious doctrinal challenges of this particular era were Docetism and Gnosticism. And so that's what some of these writings were all about. Now, to be honest, the record of accomplishing those objectives was rather mixed. That is, sometimes they were more or less successful in keeping the gospel right, getting the gospel right as they tried to preach it, or in perpetuating some of the practices of the New Testament. But we should be careful, because we should observe with some humility that we probably wouldn't have done any better. So we need to give credit where credit's due, even if we have some criticisms of how the early church managed these issues. The task of keeping the faith, again taken up by the Apostolic Fathers, was something that that we can see. Again, they did with the best that they could do. They took what they had in terms of the teaching from the apostles. And by the way, again, as the previous slide said, this was the time in which the canon was being formed. So they had some of the books of the Bible, but they didn't necessarily have all of them, or collected the way we would have a New Testament now. And so we should give them some credit for the job that they actually did. As it says there at the bottom of that slide, the term Apostolic Fathers was something that only came later, as the next slide also indicates. The name was unknown until about the end of the 17th century. That is, Apostolic Fathers was not a term they themselves went by, or even that the church for many centuries knew them by. This was something this was a title historians gave them much later. They did use the term apostolic, however. They called themselves apostolic men, or they used this term to qualify certain churches as persons and writings as apostolic, and that really meant that they came from the 2nd century. They were Christian authors, again, from this particular area, and this is the key point here, who knew or were thought to have known some of the apostles personally. Is generally accepted. We're going to find out that Polycarp was discipled by the Apostle John. Ignatius himself may have known the Apostle John. So some of these authors had at least some contact, directly or indirectly, with the apostles themselves. Who are they? The Apostolic Fathers that most church historians identify are Clement of Rome. We'll be seeing him at the end of this particular lecture. Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, the Didache, that the title just means the teaching of the 12 there, and the Epistle of Barnabas, and the Shepherd of Hermas. Now, it's important to note that church historians call certain documents church fathers. So we're not necessarily talking about individuals in every instance, but the writings that themselves came to be known as the church fathers. Others are added to this list at times, the so-called second letter of Clement, although in that case the authorship is questioned. Probably wasn't the same Clement, or Clement himself, Clement of Rome, that wrote the first letter of Clement to the Corinthians. And then the martyrdom of Polycarp, the epistle of Diognetus, and fragments of Papias, and those quite often are considered part of the Apostolic Fathers. And so we may consider them as well. The Apostolic Fathers are the earliest writers of a larger group called Ante-Nicene Fathers. Now, the Ante-Nicene Fathers are a collection of the extant writings of the Church Fathers from the Apostolic Fathers, what we're going to be considering, up to the date of the first General Council that was held in Nicaea at 325. That is, up until the 4th century. And that we're going to be looking at that in some detail when we get there. The study of these fathers, the ones we're considering, the early ante-Nicene fathers, is called the patristics. It's called patristics. That's the study of these fathers. From the Latin pater, which is father. Patristics are usually divided into the ante-Nicene fathers, that is, those who lived again before the Council of Nicaea, and the post-Nicene and post-Nicene fathers, those that wrote again during the time and after the Nicene Council. So let's begin with Clement of Rome. His name is Clement of Rome because he was a bishop of Rome, and he's usually identified that way in order to distinguish him from others who use the name Clement. He was an overseer of the house churches in Rome. We're not sure about his dates, but probably the last decade of the 1st century. The first letter of Clement that you will be reading in the selections of readings that you'll be commenting on in the other part of this course was probably the first preserved Christian writing outside of the New Testament. So it's very early, and for that reason is very interesting to us to see what they were concerned about in this era that overlapped the era of the New Testament. This was written to the church at Corinth, so it's often called Clement's letter to the Corinthians. And it was probably written before the death of the Apostle John again, so it's pretty early, and it is most likely Clement's only authentic extant writing. Now, what's really interesting about this letter is that it addresses some of the same issues that Paul did in his Corinthian correspondence in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians in the New Testament. One author notes the motivation for Clement's letter to the Corinthians was an internal dispute within the church regarding leadership. So there was some problems, as, again, if you remember 1 Corinthians in particular, about who's going to be the leader and who are people going to follow. Clement encourages them to practice humility, look to Jesus and his apostles, and the letter includes a call to repentance and encouragement to pursue holiness. All of the things, again, that the Apostle Paul encouraged them to. But most interesting, it's apparent that the Corinthians still had divisions and factions, and Clement instructed them to, this is the important part, ordered them to obey the bishop God had appointed over them. And so Clement is one of the first post-New Testament letters that begins the process of identifying the authority in the church as in the leadership in the church, the bishops in the church. It's a long letter, 65 chapters, but they're mostly short, and I think you'll find that to be interesting, even edifying reading. It's good Christian reading. Encourages them to get along, again, submit to their leaders, demonstrate humility, and behave in a manner fitting for believers. There is the strong appeal to the authority of the bishops, as I've said. And we can see here the first developments of hierarchicalism, or the idea that the bishops were the authority in the church. It was the bishops who had the authority, and it was the bishops who identified what true doctrine was. And in part of your reading, you're going to be reading about the rule of faith and that role of making sure that they kept the faith, and the job of keeping the faith, and the job of preaching the gospel, the job of making sure that the doctrine remained stable. Remember those challenges that we went through just a minute ago. That responsibility was given to the leadership of the church, or the bishops of the church. It's also interesting that Clement's letter makes reference to several canonical books, including Genesis, Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians. It's interesting because that indicates that the New Testament was being collected and shared very early. Remember, Clement's letter was probably written before the end of the 1st century. So, and I don't know why the notation there that the letter was, about Clement's letters is given twice. So sorry about that. Well, that's it for this particular lecture. In the next lecture, we'll continue our study of the Apostolic Fathers and introduce the Apostolic Father of Ignatius of Antioch.